Alrighty, chapter 14, personality. So even accounting for fundamental attribution error, scientists believe there is such a thing as personality, which is people's typical ways of thinking, feeling, or behaving. We aren't purely a product of social influences. Most psychologists broadly agree with Alport's definition of personality as consisting relatively of enduring predispositions that influence our behavior across many situations. These predispositions, also called traits, like introversion, agreeableness, etc., account in part for consistencies in our behavior across both time and situations. There are two main approaches to studying personality. The first is nomothetic approach, which strives to understand personality by identifying general laws that govern the behavior of all individuals. Most modern personality research is nomothetic because it aims to derive principles that explain the thinking, emotion, and behaviors of all people. This approach typically allows for generalization across individuals, but limited insight into the unique patterns of attributes within one person. The other approach is the idiographic approach, which strives to understand personality by identifying the unique configuration of characteristics and life history experiences within a person. Most cases are idiographic. Most case studies are idiographic. This approach reveals richly detailed tapestry of one person's life, but allows for limited generalization to other people. Moreover, it generates hypotheses that are often difficult to falsify, because these hypotheses are usually post hoc, meaning they were made after events had already occurred. So, how do personality traits originate? The first approach to explaining this is through behavior genetic methods. These help psychologists disentangle three broad sets of influences on personality: genetic factors, shared environmental factors, which are experiences that make individuals within the same house or the same family more alike. If parents try to make all their children more outgoing by reinforcing them with attention and succeed in doing so, their parenting in this case is a shared environmental factor. Then we have non-shared environmental factors, which are experiences that make individuals within the same family less alike. So if a parent treats one kid more affectionately than another, and as a consequence of this, one kid ends up with higher self-esteem than the other, the parenting in this case is a non-shared environmental factor. To distinguish between the three sets of influences, behavior geneticists have applied twin studies and adoption studies to personality. Because identical twins are more similar genetically than fraternal twins, a higher correlation among identical than fraternal twins, assuming the environmental influences on both sets of twins are comparable, suggests a genetic influence. In contrast, identical twin correlations that are equal to or less than fraternal twin correlations suggest the absence of a genetic component and instead point to non-shared environmental influences. From the findings of one landmark twin study of personality, we can see the numerous personality traits, including proneness to anxiety, impulse control, and traditionalism, which is the extent to which people behave in well-established social values, such as the importance of obeying one's parents and teachers, are influenced substantially by genetic factors. This study examined twin pairs raised together in fraternal twins who were either both male or both female. A number of studies have replicated these findings. These findings also found that non-shared environmental factors played a large role in personality because the correlations were well below 1.0. Unfortunately, these studies couldn't tell us what those non-shared environmental influences were. Additionally, researchers at the University of Minnesota spent more than 20 years accumulating the largest ever sample of identical and fraternal twins who were raised apart. So one twin was raised in one household, one with another, of about 130 people in total. Many had been separated almost immediately after birth, raised in different states or even different countries, and reunited for the first time decades later in Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport. Before this was done, some psychologists predicted confidently that identical twins reared apart would barely resemble each other in personality. What the Minnesota twin study found was that identical twins reared apart tend to be strikingly similar in personality traits and far more similar than fraternal twins reared apart. They also found that identical twins reared apart were almost as similar as identical twins reared together. This suggests that shared environment, the sum total of environmental influences shared by members of the same family, plays little to no role in the causes of adult personality. In many respects, this may be the most stunning finding in recent personality psychology, but it has yet to make an impact on popular psychology. While environmental influences play a part in childhood personality, this impact generally dissipates as we get older. By the time we reach adulthood, the impact of shared environmental influences is weak at best. As for adoption studies, these permit investigators to separate the effects of genes and environment by examining children who were separated at an early age from their biological families. The finding that an adopted child's personality is similar to that of their biological parents points to genetic influence. In contrast, the finding that an adopted child's personality is similar to their adoptive parents points towards shared environmental influence. One study found that the correlations between adopted kids and their biological parents when it came to sociability levels were slightly higher than the correlations between adoptive parents and their adopted children, even though the biological parents had essentially no environmental contact with their children after birth. Most researchers have obtained similar findings to other personality traits. These results, again, run counter to the intuitively plausible hypothesis that shared environmental influence is important in personality. So being raised together doesn't lead to much similarity in personality between parents and offspring. Researchers using twin and adoption studies have found that genes influence a variety of behaviors that are often associated with personality traits. These behaviors include divorce, religiosity, political views, and even the tendency to watch TV. Many social attitudes, including those concerning the death penalty and nudist colonies, are moderately heritable. For each of these characteristics, identical twin correlations are considerably higher than fraternal twin correlations. Now, these findings don't necessarily mean that there are specific genes that influence divorce or an opinion on the death penalty. Genes code for proteins, not specific behaviors or attitudes, and therefore affect psychological characteristics in a highly indirect fashion. Genes probably exert a high indirect influence on certain personality traits, like a tendency to experience deep emotions, but the environment shapes how these traits play out in our lives. The pathways from genes to behavior are lengthy and circuitous, so when you hear someone refer to something like the gay gene or the alcoholism gene, you should definitely be skeptical. Although there are probably genetic influences on political views, homosexuality, and even divorce, it's exceedingly unlikely that a single gene codes for those or other multifaceted behaviors. Although twin and adoption studies provide remarkably useful information concerning the heritability of personality traits, they tell us little about which genes are related to personality. In an attempt to answer this question, researchers have turned to molecular genetic studies, which may allow them to pinpoint those genes associated with specific personality traits. This rests on two premises. So first, genes code for proteins that in turn often influence the functioning of neurotransmitters such as dopamine and serotonin. And secondly, the functioning of many neurotransmitters is in turn associated with certain personality traits. For example, people with low levels of serotonin actively tend to be more impulsive and aggressive than other people are. So most modern genetic investigators are genome-wide association studies, meaning that they cast an extremely wide net examining the association between thousands of genes and a personality trait of interest. At this point, however, there have been few consistently replicated associations between specific genes and personality traits. Most likely, hundreds of genes, each exerting a tiny effect, contribute to variation across people and their personality traits. Yeah, it's that time of the semester. Unfortunately, I gotta talk about them. So long before researchers stepped in to conduct controlled studies of the causes of personality, psychologists, psychiatrists, and many others had generated theoretical models that sought to explain the development and workings of personality. These models address three key questions. How do our personalities develop? What are the core driving forces in our personalities? So essentially, like, what makes us tick? And what accounts for the individual differences in personality? Freud has shaped popular and actual psychology, especially popular psychology. Funny enough, his training wasn't actually in psychology or psychiatry. It was neurology. And largely because of his training in neurology, Freud believed that mental disorders were physiologically caused. However, his views changed dramatically in 1885 when he spent a year in Paris studying under Jean-Martin Charcot. Charcot had been treating patients, most of them women, who had a condition known as grand hysteria. They exhibited an assortment of spectacular physical symptoms, including paralysis in the arms and legs, fainting spells, and seizures. Investigation failed to turn up any physical causes of these symptoms, some of which made little or no physiological sense. Some exhibited glove anesthesia, which is a loss of sensation in the hand alone, with no accompanying loss of sensation in the arm. So glove anesthesia defies standard neurological principles because the sensory pathways extending to the hand run through the arm. So if there's an issue in the circuitry of the arm, there should be like some issues like loss of sensation, which could lead to loss of sensation in the hand. You shouldn't just have loss of sensation in the hand. This and related observations led Freud to conclude that many mental disorders were produced by psychological rather than physiological factors. He developed a theoretical model to explain these disorders, traditionally called psychoanalytic theory, and an accompanying treatment called psychoanalysis. So, Freud's theory has three core assumptions. The first is psychic determinism. So Freudians believe in psychic determinism, which is the assumption that all psychological events have a cause. We aren't free to choose our actions. Freudians claim because we're at the mercy of powerful inner forces that lie outside of our awareness. So dreams, neurotic symptoms, and Freudian slips of the tongue are all reflections of deep psychological conflict bubbling up to the surface. Moreover, for Freudians, many key influences on adult personality stem from early childhood experiences, especially parenting. The second is symbolic meaning. So for Freudians, no action, no matter how trivial it may be, is meaningless. All are attributable to preceding mental causes, even if we can't figure out what they are. Like, for example, if while teaching a class, your male professor manages to crack a long piece of chalk in two, some might be inclined to ignore this behavior. Freudians, however, would be likely to argue that this piece of chalk is symbolic of something else, almost certainly something sexual in nature. Even strict Freudians agree that not all behaviors are symbolic. Third is unconscious motivation. According to Freud, we rarely understand why we do what we do, although we quite readily cook up explanations for our actions after the fact. Some authors have likened the Freudian view of the mind to an iceberg, with the unconscious being the vast and largely uncharted area of the psyche submerged entirely underwater, and the conscious part of the mind, the part of personality that we're aware of, is merely the tip of the iceberg, barely visible above the water surface. For Freud, the unconscious is of immensely greater importance in causing our personality than the conscious. So, hopefully you guys like my little meme. So Freud believed the human psyche consists of three agencies: the id, the ego, and the superego. So for Freud, the interplay between the three gives rise to our personalities, and the differences in the strength of these agencies account largely for individual differences in personality. So most of the time, they interact harmoniously, much like a chamber music trio playing in perfect symphony. Nevertheless, the agendas of these agencies can sometimes collide, often with problematic consequences for our psychological adjustment. Indeed, Freud hypothesized that psychological distress results from conflict among these agencies. If you're attracted to your best friend's partner, your id is at odds with your ego and your superego. For Freud, internal psychological conflict is an unavoidable part of daily life. As a consequence, just about all of us are at least a little bit neurotic. Nevertheless, when neurotic conflict becomes too extreme, the result may be mental illness. So Freud believed that dreams are the road to the unconscious mind because they not only reveal the inner workings of our id in action, but also illustrate how ego and superego cooperate to keep the id's wishes in checks. According to Freud, all dreams are wish fulfillments, and that they express the id's impulses. However, they don't always seem that way on the surface because these wishes are disguised. When the superego perceives the id's desires to be threatening, it commands the ego to plaster over these wishes with symbols. Most Freudians don't regard dream symbols as universal. If you were to look for books about dreams, you would find many different definitions of dream symbols. Dream dictionaries vastly oversimplify psychoanalytic theory because Freudians believe that different symbols can mean different things to different dreamers. So, a principal function of the ego, according to Freud, is to contend with threats from the outside world. When danger arises, the ego experiences anxiety, signaling to undertake corrective actions. Sometimes these actions are straightforward, like jumping out of the way of an oncoming car. In other cases, though, we can't do much to correct the situation, so we just have to change our perception of it. In these cases, the ego engages in defense mechanisms, which are unconscious maneuvers intended to minimize anxiety. Freud and his daughter Anna, who became a psychologist in her own right later on, outlined the principal defense mechanisms. So first is repression. This is the most critical mechanism for psychoanalytic theory. This is the forgetting of emotionally threatening memories or impulses. Unlike types of forgetting, repression is presumably triggered by anxiety. We forget because we want to forget. According to Freud, we repress unhappy memories of early childhood to avoid the pain they produce. This repression leads us to experience infantile amnesia, the ability to remember anything prior to age 3. Early childhood, according to Freud, is just too anxiety-provoking for us to remember fully. We now know this explanation's unlikely because investigators have identified infantile amnesia in other animals, including mice and rats. A committed Freudian could presumably argue that mice and other rodents also repress traumatic memories of early childhood, but Occam's razor renders this explanation implausible. Next is denial. So whereas repression deals with past events, denial is the refusal to acknowledge current events in our lives, such as a serious problem in a marriage. We most often observe denial in people with psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia, although individuals undergoing extreme stress occasionally engage in denial too. It's not uncommon for the relatives of individuals who've recently died in a tragic accident to insist that their loved ones must somehow, somewhere be alive. Next is regression. This is the act of returning psychologically to a younger age, typically early childhood when life was simpler and safer. Older children who've long since stopped sucking their thumb sometimes suddenly resume thumb sucking under stress. Next, we have reaction formation. This is the transformation of an anxiety-provoking emotion into the opposite. The observable emotion we actually see reflects the opposite emotion of the person, or that the person feels unconsciously. So Freud contended that we can infer the presence of a reaction formation by the intensity with which the person expresses the emotion, as this emotion displays an exaggerated or phony quality. In a study by Adams and Associates, they found that males with high levels of homophobia showed significantly greater increases in sexual arousal than those with low levels of homophobia when shown videos of men engaging in sexual activity with each other. Consistent with Freud's concept of reaction formation, some homophobes may harbor unconscious homosexual impulses they find acceptable and transform them into a conscious dislike of homosexuals. However, there is an alternative explanation. Anxiety can increase sexual arousal. So, another defense mechanism is projection. This is the unconscious attribution of our negative characteristics to others. According to psychoanalysis, people with paranoia are projecting their unconscious hostility onto others. Deep down, they want to harm others, but because they can't accept these impulses, they perceive others as wanting to harm them. Another is displacement. This is closely related to projection. This is where we direct an impulse from a socially unacceptable target onto a safer and more socially acceptable target. So after a frustrating day at work, we may pound our fist against the punching bag at the gym rather than into the faces of annoying coworkers. Don't do that, that's assault. So punching bag, much safer alternative. Next, we have rationalization. This provides a reasonable sounding explanation for our unreasonable behaviors or for failures. Some people who receive post-hypnotic suggestions to perform bizarre actions engage in rationalizations to explain these actions. A related defense mechanism, intellectualism, allows us to avoid anxiety by thinking about abstract and interpersonal ideas. Next, we have sublimation. This transforms a socially unacceptable impulse into an admired goal. One striking example of sublimation is the story of a man who sets fires in childhood and went on to become chief at his local fire department as an adult. So Freud's theory also includes his theory of psychosexual development, which is covered in the chapter. I'm not covering it here. So Freud's psychoanalytic theory has greatly influenced our thinking about personality, and for that reason alone, his ideas merit careful examination. Even Freud's most vocal detractors acknowledge that he was an ingenious thinker, but ingenuity should not be confused with scientific support. Many authors have raised troubling questions concerning the scientific status of psychoanalytic theory. There are 5 major criticisms. First, unfalsifiability. I know I've touched on this briefly in previous lectures, but critics have noticed that many hypotheses derived from Freudian theory are difficult or impossible to refute. To take just one example, the concept of defense mechanisms of reaction formation offers a convenient escape hatch that allows many psychoanalytic hypotheses to evade falsification. We found that most 5-year-old boys are sexually repulsed by their moms. Would this refute the Oedipal complex? I'm sorry, I can't talk today. No, Freudians would argue that these boys are engaging in reaction formation and are attracted to their moms at an unconscious level. Indeed, Freud often used ad hoc maneuvers to protect his pet hypotheses from refutation. One of Freud's patients intensely disliked her mother-in-law and took pains to ensure that she wouldn't spend a summer vacation with her, yet while in therapy with Freud, she dreamt of spending a summer vacation with her mother-in-law. This dream seemingly falsifies Freud's theory that all dreams are wish fulfillments, but Freud argued that her dream supported his theory because her underlying wish was to prove Freud incorrect. Although we might marvel at Freud's ingenuity, this reasoning renders psychoanalytic theory very difficult to falsify. And remember, if you can't falsify it, it's not a good theory. Another major criticism is failed predictions. Although much of Freudian theory is difficult to falsify, those portions of the theory that can be falsified often have been falsified. For example, Freud claimed that children exposed to overly harsh toilet training would grow up to be rigid and perfectionists. But most investigators have found no association there. Additionally, despite multiple attempts to measure them, there is little scientific support for Freud's defense mechanisms, including repression. In particular, participants in one study were no more likely to forget negative memories than positive memories. Freud also predicted that his preferred method of treatment, namely psychoanalysis, was the only route to improvement. Even though his treatment has been shown to be more effective than no treatment at all, there is no compelling evidence that it's more effective than a variety of other psychological interventions, including those focused on the present rather than early childhood. Another major criticism is a questionable conception of the unconscious. There's increasing reason to accept Freud's claim that our behavior is performed unconsciously. Nevertheless, there's increasing reason to doubt Freud's specific conceptualization of the unconscious. In fairness to Freud, he was almost surely right about two important things. We're often unaware of why we do things, and we then convince ourselves after the fact of plausible but often erroneous explanations of why we did them. Nisbet and Wilson reviewed a lot of studies demonstrating that we often convince ourselves that we behave for reasons that are plausible but incorrect. Recent evidence suggests that subliminally presented stimuli, that is, stimuli presented below the threshold of awareness, can sometimes affect our behavior in subtle ways. Other highly controversial evidence derives from priming paradigms, in which researchers observed the effects of subtle stimuli on people's behavior. In one study, researchers primed some participants, but not others, with words relevant to old age in the context of a language task. Remarkably, after the study was over, primed participants walked down the hallway more slowly than did unprimed participants. Nevertheless, several research teams have failed to replicate this and similar priming findings, so there's reason to be skeptical of them. Some of the positive results we've described may seem to support Freudian theory because they suggest that factors of which we're unaware influence our behavior. Still, they don't provide evidence for the unconscious. Freud viewed the unconscious as a place, basically like this massive reservoir of impulses and memories submerged beneath awareness. But research doesn't support the existence of this place, let alone tell us where it's located. A fourth criticism is reliance on unrepresentative samples. Many authors have charged that Freud based his theories on atypical samples, but generalized them to the rest of humanity. Most of Freud's patients were upper-class neurotic Viennese women, a far cry from the average Nigerian man or Malaysian woman. Freud's theories may therefore possess limited external validity for people from other cultural backgrounds. Moreover, although Freud's methods of inquiry were idiographic, his theory was nomothetic. He studied a relatively small number of individuals in depth, but applied his theories to everybody. And number 5 is flawed assumption of shared environmental influences. So many Freudian hypotheses presume that shared environment plays a key role in molding personality, which, as we've seen, isn't true, or isn't really true. In summary, Freudian theory has had a profound influence on modern conceptions of the mind, but much of it is problematic from a scientific standpoint. The one insight of Freud's that's best stood the test of time is that we're often unaware of the causes of our behavior, but this insight wasn't original to Freud and is consistent with other models of personality, including behaviorism. Finally, several scholars have tried to argue that Freud's insights are consistent with recent findings from neuroscience, but it's not clear that brain imaging findings offer especially compelling support for psychoanalytic views. So Neo-Freudianism developed largely out of criticism of Freudian theory. A lot of those who followed this were Freud's own students. Because they modified Freud's views in significant ways, they're called Neo-Freudians. So most Neo-Freudian theories share with Freudian theory an emphasis on unconscious influences and importance of early experience and personality. Nevertheless, these theories differ from Freudian theories in two key ways. First, compared with Freudian theory, Neo-Freudian theories place less emphasis on sexuality as a driving force in personality and more emphasis on social drives like the need for approval. Secondly, compared with Freudian theories, most Neo-Freudian theories are more optimistic concerning the prospects for personality growth throughout the lifespan. Freud was notoriously pessimistic about the possibility of personality change after childhood. He once wrote that the primary goal of psychoanalysis was to transform neurotic misery into ordinary, everyday happiness. So one of the most prominent ones was Alfred Adler. He was the first major follower of Freud to defect from the old ways. According to Adler, the principal motive in human personality is not sex or aggression, but the striving for superiority. Adler believed that our overriding goal in life is to be better than others. We aim to accomplish this goal by crafting our distinctive style of life, which is a long-standing pattern of achieving superiority over our peers. People may try to satisfy their superiority strivings by becoming famous entertainers, great athletes, or outstanding parents. Adler maintained that neurotic difficulties stem from early childhood, and children are either pampered or neglected by their parents. And that puts them at a later risk for an inferiority complex, which is feelings of low self-esteem that can lead to overcompensation for such feelings. As a result, they often attempt to demonstrate their superiority to others at all costs, even if it means dominating them. For Adler, most forms of mental illnesses are unhealthy attempts to overcompensate for the inferiority complex. Adler's hypotheses, like most of Freud's, are difficult to falsify. Critics once asked Adler to explain how someone's decision to become homeless with alcoholism supported his theory that people always try to attain superiority over others. He responded that such a person has selected a lifestyle that affords a convenient excuse for being unable to achieve greatness. In effect, they can tell themselves, if I didn't drink, I'd be successful. As we can see, with a little creativity, we can cook up an Adlerian explanation after the fact for almost every behavior, and I'm pretty sure it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyways. You can probably see why his theories were just, they were problematic, even just a little bit, Next we have Carl Jung. His big thing was the collective unconscious. So, although Freud originally anointed Jung to be the standard bearer of the next generation of psychoanalysis, Jung became disenchanted with Freud's overemphasis on sexuality. Jung's views have become enormously influential in popular psychology, and Jung is something of a cult figure in popular psychology circles. So Jung argued that in addition to Freud's version of the unconscious, which he called the personal unconscious, there's also a collective unconscious, which is our shared storehouse of memories that ancestors have passed down to us across generations. He believed the collective unconscious accounted for cultural similarities in myths and legends. Jung argued that we recognize our mothers immediately after birth because the memories of thousands of generations of individuals who've seen their mothers after birth have been passed down to us genetically. Jung further believed that the collective unconscious contains numerous archetypes, which are cross-culturally universal symbols, which explain the similarities among people and their emotional reactions to many features of the world. Archetypes include the mother, the goddess, the hero, and the mandala, or circle, which Jung believes symbolize a desire for wholeness or unity. Some psychotherapists use Jungian sample therapy to uncover children's deep-seated conflicts. These practitioners try to infer children's archetypes based on the kinds of shapes they draw in the sand and use them as a springboard for therapy. Nevertheless, there's no evidence that Jungian sample therapy is effective, even though it's probably a lot of fun for the kids, and possibly the therapist too. Provocative as it is, Jung's theory suffers from some of the same shortcomings as Freud and Adler. It's difficult to falsify as it generates few clear-cut predictions. Additionally, although Jung hypothesized that archetypes are transmitted to us from our ancestral past, he may not have sufficiently considered a rival explanation. Perhaps archetypes are cross-culturally universal because they reflect crucial elements in the environment like women, wise elders, the sun, the moon, that people across all cultures experience. Shared experiences rather than shared genes may account for the commonalities in archetypes around the world. With all of this being said, I think archetypes are neat. I know they're not scientifically great. There's a lot of scientific issues with them. But I think they're cool, and I kind of wish there was more scientific evidence to support them, but it is what it is. That's why I made this little meme. I just think they're neat. So the next is Karen Horney. She was the first major feminist personality theorist. Although not departing drastically from Freud's core assumptions, she took aim at these aspects of his theory that she saw as gender biased. So she maintained that women's sense of inferiority came from their excessive dependency on men, which was ingrained in them from an early age. While this is obviously not great in current society, Horney's ideas came about in the early 1900s. Back then women were pretty dependent on men. They couldn't own property, a lot of women weren't in the workforce, etc. If they did have a job, it didn't pay well, so I'm not justifying her theories, I'm just providing a little context. So, Freudian theory examined scientifically. So many neo-Freudian theories tempered some of the excesses of Freudian theory. They pointed out that anatomy isn't always destiny when it comes to psychological differences between the sexes, and they argued that social influences must be reckoned with in the development of personality. By and large, they also recognized that personality is less fixed over time than Freud had assumed. Nevertheless, as we've seen, falsifiability remains a serious concern for neo-Freudian theories, especially those of Adler and Jung. As a consequence, their scientific standing remains almost as controversial as that of Freudian theory, which is why, as I mentioned toward the beginning of the semester, Freudian theory, that's not it. Same thing with neo-Freudian theories. So behaviorism is both a learning theory and a theory of personality. So radical behaviorists like B.F. Skinner believe that differences in our personalities stem largely from differences in our learning histories. Unlike Freudians, radical behaviorists reject the notion that the first few years of life are especially critical in personality development. Childhood definitely matters, but our learning histories continue to mold our personalities throughout the lifespan. For radical behaviorists, our personalities are bundles of habits acquired by classical and operant conditioning. In contrast to other personality theorists, radical behaviorists don't believe that personality causes behavior. For them, personality consists of behaviors. These behaviors are both overt, so observable, or covert, unobservable, such as thoughts and feelings. A radical behaviorist wouldn't have much trouble accepting the idea that some people are extroverted or that extroverted people tend to have many friends and attend many parties. A radical behaviorist would strongly dispute the conclusion that certain people have many friends and attend many parties because they're extroverted. So radical behaviorists view personality as under the control of two major influences, genetic factors and contingencies in the environment, which are reinforcers and punishers in the environment. Together, these influences explain why our personalities differ. Like psychoanalytics, or Freudians, radical behaviorists and determinists, they believe that all of our actions are products of pre-existing causal influences. This is one of the precious few issues on which Freud and Skinner would have probably agreed. For radical behaviorists, free will is an illusion. We may believe we're free to perform behaviors, but we're fooling ourselves. We're convinced that we're free to select our behaviors only because we're usually oblivious to the situational influences that trigger them. Freudians and behaviorists agree that we often don't understand the reasons for our behavior, but their views of why is the reason they differ sharply. For Skinner, we're unconscious of many things because we're often unaware of immediate situational influences on our behavior. We may have had the experience of suddenly humming a song to ourselves and wondering why we're doing that, until we realized the song had been playing softly on the radio. According to Skinner, we were initially unaware of the external cause of the behavior. However, such awareness is a far cry from the Freudian unconscious, which is a vast storehouse of inaccessible thoughts, memories, and impulses. For radical behaviorists, there's no such storehouse because the unconscious variables that play a role in causing behavior lie outside, not inside of us. Although initially influenced by radical behaviorists, social learning theorists, these are theorists who emphasize thinking as a central cause of personality, sometimes called social cognitive theorists, believe that Skinner had gone too far in his wholesale rejection of the influences of thought on behavior. Spurred by Tolman and others who believe that learning depends on our plans and goals, these theorists emphasize thinking as a cause of personality. How we interpret our environments affects how we react to them. If we perceive others as threatening, we'll typically be hostile and suspicious in return. According to social learning theorists, classical conditioning and operant conditioning are not automatic or reflexive processes. They're the products of cognition. As we acquire information in classical and operant conditioning, we're actively thinking about and interpreting what this information means. So most social learning theorists hold a more complex view of determinism than do radical behaviorists. As we learned earlier, Bandura made a compelling case for reciprocal determinism, which is the tendency of people to naturally influence each other's behavior. Our high levels of extroversion may motivate us to meet new people and make friends. In turn, our newly found friends may reinforce our extroversion, encouraging us to attend parties we'd otherwise skip. Attending these parties may result in our acquiring additional friends who further reinforce our extroversion, and so on. On a separate note, please don't attend parties right now. There's a pandemic. Stay home. Alright. Social learning theorists propose that much of learning occurs by watching others. As we learned previously, observational learning appears to be a key form of learning neglected by traditional behaviorists. Observational learning greatly expands the range of stimuli from which we can benefit. It also means that our parents and teachers can play significant roles in shaping our personalities because we acquire both good and bad habits by watching and later emulating them. Social learning theorists emphasize individuals' sense of control over life events. So Rotter introduced the concept of locus of control, which is the extent to which people believe that reinforcers and punishers lie inside or outside their control. People with an internal locus of control, called internals, believe that life events are due largely to their own efforts and personal characteristics. In contrast, people with an external locus of control, externals, believe that life events are largely a product of chance and fate. Rotter hypothesized that internals are less prone than externals to emotional upset following life stressors because they're more likely to believe they can remedy problems on their own. Indeed, almost all forms of psychological distress, depression, and anxiety are associated with an external locus of control. However, it's not clear whether these correlational findings reflect a causal relationship between external locus of control and mental disorders. Perhaps once people develop depression or anxiety, they begin to feel their lives are spiraling out of control, or perhaps people who doubt their abilities are prone to an external locus of control on the one hand, and depression and anxiety on the other. So Skinner and his fellow radical behaviorist agreed with Freud that our behavior is determined and that free will is an illusion, but they maintain that the primary causes of our behavior lie outside rather than inside us. Even critics of radical behaviorism acknowledge that Skinner and his followers placed the field of psychology on firmer scientific footing. Many of them believe the claim of radical behaviorists that our thoughts play no causal role in our behavior is implausible from an evolutionary perspective. Natural selection has endowed us with an enormous cerebral cortex, which is specialized for problem solving, planning, reasoning, and other high-level cognitive processes. It seems difficult to comprehend why our huge cortices have evolved if our thoughts were merely byproducts of contingencies. Social learning theorists rekindled psychologists' interest in thinking and argued that observational learning is a crucial form of learning in addition to classical and operant conditioning. Nevertheless, social learning theory isn't immune to criticism. In particular, the claim that observational learning exerts a powerful influence over our personalities implies an important causal role of shared environment. After all, if we learn by modeling the behaviors of our parents and other relatives, we should become like them. However, as we've learned, behavior genetic studies have shown that the effects of shared environmental influences on adult personality are weak or non-existent. Although social learning theorists believe that learning processes depend on cognition. Scientists have observed these processes in animals with tiny cerebral cortexes and even some with no cortexes at all. For example, conditioning has been seen in honeybees and starfish. There's even evidence that classical conditioning occurs in such microscopic organisms as protozoa. There have also been reported observational learning in octopi, although these findings are controversial. The fact that learning occurs in animals with quite simple nervous systems implies any one of three things. First, perhaps social learning theorists are wrong that basic forms of learning depend on cognition. Second, perhaps the thinking processes involved in these forms of learning are primitive in certain cases, although we might justifiably question if a starfish is capable of genuine thought. Third, the learning processes of simple animals may rely on different mechanisms from those of humans. At this point, the scientific evidence doesn't really have a clear answer. Psychoanalytic theory, along with behavioral and social learning models, dominated personality psychology throughout the first half of the 20th century. In the 50s and 60s, humanistic models emerged as a third force in personality psychology. Humanistic psychologists rejected the strict determinism of psychoanalysis and behaviorists and embraced the notion of free will. We're perfectly free, they maintained, to choose either socially constructive or destructive paths in life. Most humanistic psychologists propose that the core motive in personality is self-actualization, which is the drive to develop our innate potential to the fullest possible extent. Most Freudians would say that self-actualization would be disastrous for society because our innate drives, housed in the id, are selfish and potentially harmful if not controlled. For Freudians, a society of self-actualized people would result in sheer pandemonium. Humanistic theorists, in contrast, view human nature as inherently constructive, so they see self-actualization as a worthy goal. The best-known humanistic theorist was Carl Rogers, who used his personality theory as a point of departure for an influential form of psychotherapy that's covered later in the text. Rogers believed that we could all achieve our potential and emotional fulfillment if only society allowed it. So according to Rogers, our personality consists of three major components: organism, self, and conditions of worth. The organism is our innate and substantially genetically influenced blueprint. In this regard, it's like the Freudian id, except for Rogers viewed the organism as inherently positive and helpful toward others. But Rogers wasn't super specific about the makeup of the organism. The self is our self-concept, the set of beliefs about who we are. Conditions of worth are the expectations we place on ourselves for appropriate and inappropriate behavior. Like the Freudian superego, they emanate from our parents and society, and eventually we internalize them. Conditions of worth arise typically in childhood, when others make their acceptance of us conditional on certain behaviors but not others. As a result, we accept ourselves only if we act in certain ways. For Rogers, individual differences in personality stem largely from differences in conditions of worth that others impose on us. Although in his idealistic moments, Rogers envisioned a world in which conditions of worth no longer existed, he reluctantly acknowledged that in modern society, even the best adjusted among us inevitably harbor certain conditions of worth. Conditions of worth result in incongruence, which is inconsistency between our personalities and innate dispositions. We're no longer our genuine selves because we're acting in ways that are inconsistent with our genuine personalities. So whereas Rogers focused largely on individuals whose tendencies towards self-actualization were thwarted and therefore ended up with psychological problems, Maslow focused on individuals who were self-actualized, especially historical figures. He regarded full self-actualization as a rare feat, one accomplished by only about 2% of people. Among those who Maslow considered self-actualized were Thomas Jefferson, Abe Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., Helen Keller, and Mahatma Gandhi. I hope I said that right. Probably didn't. According to Maslow, self-actualized people tend to be creative, spontaneous, and accepting of themselves and others. They're self-confident, but not self-centered. They focus on real-world and intellectual problems and have a few deep friendships rather than many superficial ones. Contrary to what we might expect, self-actualized individuals typically crave privacy and can come off as aloof or even difficult to deal with because they've outgrown the need to be popular. As a consequence, they're not afraid to rock the boat when necessary or express unpopular opinions. They're also prone to peak experiences which is a transcendent moment of intense excitement and tranquility marked by a profound sense of connection to the world. So humanistic models of personality boldly proclaim the importance of free will and personal choice and appeal to a generation of young people disenfranchised with the determinism of psychoanalysis and behaviorism. However, investigators in comparative psychology, which is a branch of psychology that compares behaviors across species, have challenged Rogers' claims that human nature is entirely positive. Their research suggests that the capacity for aggression is inherent in our primate relatives. There's also evidence that from twin studies that aggression is part of humans' genetic heritage. Therefore, actualization of our full genetic potential is unlikely to bring about the state of eternal bliss that Rogers imagined. At the same time, research suggests that the capacity of altruism is intrinsic in both chimps and people. It seems that human nature is a complex mix of selfish and selfish and selfless acts. Rogers' research demonstrated that the discrepancy between people's descriptions of their actual versus ideal selves, greater for emotionally disturbed than for emotionally healthy individuals. This difference decreases over the course of psychotherapy. Rogers interpreted this finding as reflecting a lessening of conditions of worth. However, these results are hard to interpret because the people who showed decreases and incongruence following therapy weren't the same people who improved. Maslow's research on the characteristics of self-actualized people paved the way for today's influential but controversial positive psychology movement. Indeed, although he rarely receives credit for it, Maslow introduced the term. However, his work is problematic on methodological grounds. In beginning the assumption that self-actualized individuals tend to be more creative and spontaneous, Maslow may have limited his search to historical figures who displayed these traits. As such, he may have fallen prey to confirmation bias, because he once blind to his hypothesis concerning the personality features of self-actualized individuals. He had no sure way of guarding against the bias. Humanistic models are also difficult to falsify. If a study of the general population showed that many people were self-actualized, humanistic psychologists could interpret this finding as evidence that self-actualization is a key influence on personality. If this study showed that virtually no one was self-actualized, humanistic psychologists could explain away this finding by saying that most individuals' drives toward self-actualization had been stifled. Although the claim that self-actualization is the central motive in personality may not be testable scientifically, the principle that we should develop our potential to the fullest may have considerable value as a philosophy of life. So in contrast to most personality theorists, proponents of trait models are interested primarily in describing and understanding the structure of personality. That is, they examine the question of what makes up our personality rather than what causes it. So, invoking personality traits as causes of behavior has its challenges. To start with, we have to avoid the circular reasoning fallacy. To avoid this, we need to demonstrate that personality traits predict behaviors in novel situations or are correlated with biological or lab measures. From there, we need to narrow down the pool of possible traits. As Alport observed, there are over 17,000 terms in English, just English, referring to personality traits, shy, stubborn, impulsive, etc. To reduce this enormous diversity of traits to a much smaller number of personality traits, they used a technique called factor analysis, which analyzes the correlations between responses on personality inventories and other measures. So here are a couple examples of what factor analysis looks like. If you see a table or a figure like these in a paper, they most likely did a factor analysis of some variety. Essentially, factor analysis looks at how well and how closely certain things group up on a scale or a measure. For example, in the figure, if you look at A, this shows 6 items on a scale grouping up well all together. B shows two factors with 6 items evenly loading across the two. So 3 items load onto each factor. Typically, these groupings are determined by how highly correlated items are with each other. So if you look at the table, this shows the correlations the items have with each other. So typically you want something 0.4, 0.5, or higher. And if the two items have a low correlation with each other, there's a good chance they won't group well together. We've all heard the phrase, they mix like oil and water. Well, factor analysis is separating out the oil from the water. Big Five. There's a pretty good chance you've heard of the Big Five at some point, or at least aspects of it. So while there is no universal consensus among trait theorists regarding the most scientifically supported model of personality structure, one model has gained a lot of traction and support. The Big Five, also called Ocean, consists of 5 traits that have surfaced repeatedly in factor analyses of reasonably comprehensive personality measures. It was uncovered using a lexical approach, which is the assumption that the most crucial features of personality are embedded in our language. So here's the logic. If a personality trait is important enough in our daily lives, it's likely that we'll talk about it a lot. So according to Costa, McCrae, and Associates, these 5 domains are as follows. First, we have openness to experience. So open people tend to be intellectually curious and unconventional in their interest and outlook on the world. One example might be someone who really enjoys foods and treats from a culture they aren't a part of that's not mainstream. Another might be someone who enjoys visiting different countries to experience the culture of the country. Next, we have conscientiousness. So conscientious people tend to be careful and responsible. One example of this is students that get their work done well before the deadline. Next, we have extroversion. So extroverted people tend to be social and lively. This one's pretty self-explanatory. This is one of the few aspects of psychology that is represented well in the media. Next, we have agreeableness. So agreeable people tend to be sociable and easy to get along with. One example of this might be people who have like a stereotypical golden retriever personality, just happy and easygoing and fun to hang out with. And lastly, we have neuroticism. So neurotic people tend to be tense and moody. One example is people who suffer from an anxiety disorder. And fun fact, anxiety and neuroticism tend to be very highly positively correlated, meaning when one goes up, so does the other. So according to Big Five advocates, we can use these factors to describe the differences among just about everybody, including those with psychological disorders. Each of us occupies some location on each of these dimensions, with most of us falling roughly in the middle of the distributions. However, people with psychological disorders tend to receive extreme scores on one or more of the dimensions. Remarkably, the Big Five appear in people's ratings of personality even when researchers ask participants to describe people they've only seen, not met. This finding suggests that we harbor implicit personality theories, which are intuitive ideas concerning personality traits and their associations with behavior. Some dating sites even use the Big Five to match people up, one of which is eHarmony. Gosling and others suggested that the Big Five, in addition to a 6th trait of dominance, also emerges in chimpanzees, but this has been criticized. Big Five predict a wealth of important real-world behaviors, suggesting that personality matters when it comes to everyday life. High conscientiousness, low neuroticism, and high agreeableness are all associated with successful job performance and good grades. They even seem to play a role in predicting presidential success. Fun fact. Researchers have found that the Big Five dimensions can be found in China, Japan, Italy, Hungary, Turkey, and many other countries. So I just want to pause here and emphasize how cross-culturally this has been studied. I know I've harped to you guys all semester about cross-cultural stuff, but they did it right here. This is an excellent example. Nevertheless, there may be limits to the Big Five's cross-cultural universality, raising the possibility that manifestation of personality may be shaped in important ways by culture. Openness to experience does not emerge in all cultures, and some investigators have found dimensions in addition to the Big Five. For example, studies in China found China tradition, which encompasses aspects of personality distinctive to Chinese culture, including an emphasis on group harmony and saving face to avoid embarrassment. So personality traits may be less predictive of behavior in collectivistic cultures, probably because people's behavior in collectivistic culture is more influenced by social norms. With that being said, it's important to not overgeneralize individualistic or collectivistic cultures, or countries, both. Each only has about 60%-ish of their population that reflect their respective characteristics. Additionally, Asian countries differ widely on their level of collectivism, so it's important not to paint them all with the same brush. So the Big Five is a useful system for organizing individual differences in personality. Nevertheless, there's reason to question if the lexical approach is sufficient for telling us everything about personality traits, as many people may not be consciously aware of all important features of personality. As a consequence, our language may not adequately reflect these features. Additionally, there's no Big Five factor corresponding to morality, despite the centrality of this variable to many theories of personality. Eysenck, I think that's how you say it, Tellegen and others maintain that 3 dimensions rather than 5 offer the most accurate model of personality structure. According to them, the Big Five dimensions of agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to experience combine to form one larger dimension of impulse control, or fearfulness, along with the dimensions of extroversion and neuroticism. So personality traits don't tell the whole story of why we differ from each other. Basic tendencies are underlying personality traits, whereas characteristic adaptations are their behavior manifestations. The key point is that people can express their personality traits in dramatically different outlets depending on their upbringing, interests, and skills. Sensation seeking, which is the tendency to seek out new and exciting stimuli, offers an intriguing example of this. So high sensation seekers often enjoy like parachuting out of an airplane, really spicy food, living life in the fast lane. In contrast, low sensation seekers dislike risk, adventure, and novelty. Like many personality traits, sensation seeking may be a double-edged sword, and that it may be tied to socially constructed behaviors, and some people, but socially destructive behaviors in others. Apparently, people can express tendencies toward risk-taking and danger-seeking in either socially constructive ways, like firefighters, or socially destructive ways, like serial killers. So longitudinal studies demonstrate that prior to age 30, personality traits sometimes do change over time, sometimes substantially. Across the general public, openness, extroversion, and neuroticism tend to decline a bit from late teens to early 30s, whereas conscientiousness and agreeableness tend to increase a bit. Studies also show that levels of most traits don't change much after 30, they change even less after 50. We don't know if psychotherapy can change personality, but many psychologists today are even less optimistic about it than they were in Freud's day. The last 2 decades have witnessed a good deal of discussion about if medication can change personality traits, especially extroversion and neuroticism. There's anecdotal evidence that certain mood-altering medications like Zoloft and Xanax produce calmness and decrease shyness, even among people without mental illness, perhaps suggesting that these drugs may allow us to become better than well. Although the evidence is preliminary, the results of one study demonstrate that well-adjusted people who ingest Paxil experience less hostility and more interest in socializing than those who ingested a placebo. In more recent studies, among people with clinical depression, Paxil and Zoloft increased levels of such traits as extroversion and fearlessness and decreased levels of traits such as neuroticism and impulsivity. These findings raise intriguing scientific, practical, and ethical questions. On the scientific side, Might our personalities be easier to modify than we have supposed? On the practical and ethical sides, could the use of medication to change personality have any important disadvantages? Evolutionary psychologists have long argued that many emotions serve essential adaptive functions. Anxiety, for example, may be a crucial warning sign of disaster or danger. If we reduced anxiety, could we produce a civilization of people unconcerned about impending disaster or doom? So, as far as scientific evaluation, Mischel found low correlations among different behaviors presumed to reflect the same trait. Mischel concluded that measures of personality aren't especially helpful for what they were designed to do, which is forecast behavior. Some psychologists later tried to explain our persistent belief in the predictive power of personality traits in terms of our cognitive biases, especially the fundamental attribution error. For them, we see people's personalities all around us because we mistake situational influences on their behavior for personality influences. Were his criticisms valid? Yes and no, kinda, sorta. Seymour Epstein noted that Mischel was correct that personality traits aren't highly predictive of isolated behavior, such as lying or cheating in a single situation. Nevertheless, in several studies, Epstein showed that personality traits are often highly predictive of aggregate behavior on composite behavior averaged across studies. In contrast to other personality theories, trait models are primarily efforts to describe individual differences in personality rather than to explain their causes. This emphasis on description is both a strength and weakness. On one hand, these models have advanced our understanding of personality structure and helped psychologists predict performance in jobs. On the other hand, some trait models don't provide much insight into the cases of personality. Some researchers tried to remedy this shortcoming. For example, according to Eysenck, the personality dimensions of extroversion, introversion is produced by differences in the threshold of arousal of the reticular activating system, also known as RAS. So the RAS controls alertness and are responsible for keeping us awake. While the following is paradoxical, Eysenck believed that extroverts have an underactive RAS and that they're perpetually bored, so they seek stimulation. In contrast, introverts tend to have an overactive RAS and that they try to minimize or shut out stimulation. Even though evidence for this isn't consistent, Eysenck's theorizing demonstrates that theories can generate fruitful hypotheses concerning the relations between personality traits and biological variables. Personality psychology has long been plagued by a parade of less than great measurements. Phrenology purported to detect people's personality traits by measuring the patterns of bumps on their heads. Related to this was physiognomy, which claimed to detect people's personality traits from their facial characteristics. The term lowbrow, which today refers to someone who's uncultured or not very smart, derives from the old belief that most non-intellectual people have protruding foreheads and a low brow line. This claim, like the rest of physiognomy, has been falsified. I do want to note here that just like in phrenology, physiognomy is based around racism and sexism. The norm they used to establish this technique was a European beauty standard, so just something to kind of keep in mind. Still, like many erroneous beliefs, physiognomy may contain a tiny, tiny, tiny kernel of truth. Research suggests that women do better than chance at figuring out which men are most interested in children merely by looking at still photographs of their faces. In another study, observers accurately gauged men's tendencies toward physical aggression by glancing briefly at their faces. In a similar fashion, William Sheldon believed he could draw inferences about people's personalities based on their body types. Highly muscular people, mesomorphs, he thought tend to be assertive and bold, whereas lean and skinny people, ectomorphs, tend to be introverted and intellectual. And this is where the age-old jock nerd tropes come from. The stereotype of the jock guy being really buff, and then the nerd being really skinny, glasses. So, you get the idea. However, Sheldon failed to consider an alternative explanation. He wasn't blind to people's body types when he judged their personality traits, and may have fallen prey to confirmation bias. Later, well-controlled studies found that correlations between Sheldon's body types and personality traits were weak or non-existent. With these errors in mind, how can we distinguish scientific from non-scientific or even pseudoscientific personality assessment measures? Two key criteria for evaluating all tests, including personality are reliability and validity. Recall that reliability is the consistency of measurement, and validity is the extent to which the scale measures what it says it does. Additionally, there are two major types of personality test, structured and unstructured. So the first type is the structured personality test. So the best known personality instruments are structured personality tests. These are paper and pencil measures consisting of questions that respondents answer in one of a few fixed ways. By fixed ways, they mean choosing between true and false, or selecting options on a scale, typically in a Likert or Likert format. I've heard it pronounced both ways, I'm not sure which is accurate. Which is basically a scale of 0 to 4 or a scale of 1 to 5. How well do you think this describes you? So structured personality tests have several disadvantages. Several advantages. They're typically easy to administer and score, and they allow researchers to collect data from many participants simultaneously. So the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or MMPI, is the most extensively researched of all structured personality tests. Psychologists around the world use the MMPI to detect symptoms of major mental disorders. And the MMPI-2, which is the revised version, consists of 10 basic scales, 8 of which are designed to detect symptoms of several major mental disorders, like paranoia, depression, and schizophrenia. Hathaway and McKinley developed these scales by means of an empirical method of test construction, which is an approach to building tests in which researchers begin with 2 or more criterion groups and examine which items best differentiate them. For example, the items on the MMPI depression scale are those that best differentiate people with clinical depression from those with no diagnosed mental disorder. One consequence of this method is that many MMPI and MMPI-2 items possess low face validity, which is the extent to which respondents can tell what the items are measuring. So in a face valid test, meaning something with high face validity, we can take the items on face value, meaning they assess what they seem to assess. So face validity is actually a misnomer because it isn't actually really a form of validity, which is, weird. So because Hathaway and McKinley were concerned only with if, not why, MMPI items differentiated among criterion groups, they ended up with many items that bear little obvious connection with the disorder they supposedly assess. So researchers can't agree if low face validity is an overall advantage or disadvantage. Some believe that items with low face validity assess key aspects of personality that are subtle or lie outside the respondent's awareness. Moreover, such items have the advantage of being difficult for respondents to fake. In contrast, other researchers believe that these items don't add to the MMPI's diagnostic capacity. The MMPI-2 contain 3 major validity scales. These scales detect various response sets, which are tendencies to distort responses to items. So response sets, which can diminish the validity of psychological tests, include impression management, which is making ourselves look better, and malingering, making ourselves seem psychologically disturbed. So the MMPI-L, which is the lie scale, consists of items assessing the denial of trivial faults. If you deny a large number of such faults, you're engaging in impression management. The F, or frequency scale, consists of items that people in the general population rarely endorse. High scores on the F scale can indicate malingering, though they can also reflect serious psychological disturbance or carelessness in responding to items. The K, or correction scale, consists of items that are similar to, although subtler, than those on the L scale. This scale measures defensive or guarded responding. Psychologists plot the 10 basic scales and 3 validity scales of MMPI-2 in profile form, which displays the pattern of each person's scale scores. Although many clinicians enjoy interpreting the MMPI-2 profiles, research demonstrates that simple statistical formulas that can be programmed into a computer yield interpretations that are equally, if not more, valid than those of experienced clinicians. Nevertheless, these findings, which hold true for not only the MMPI-2, but also for most or even all personality tests, seem not to have exerted an appreciable impact on clinical practice. So, extensive research supports the reliability of most MMPI-2 scales, as well as their validity for differentiating among mental disorders. For example, the MMPI-2 schizophrenia scale distinguishes individuals with schizophrenia from those with other severe disorders like clinical depression. Nevertheless, the MMPI-2 is problematic in several respects. Many of its scales are correlated highly and are therefore largely redundant with each other, probably because they're all contaminated with the broad dimension of emotional maladjustment. As a consequence, several MMPI-2 scales largely measure the same thing, namely overall psychological distress and low morale. In an effort to minimize this flaw, some researchers have recently developed a briefer, restructured version of the MMPI-2 that contains scales that are more independent on this dimension. The evidence for validity of the restructured version of the MMPI-2 is promising, although it's still too early to tell if this version will be an improvement over the existing version. In addition, psychologists can't use MMPI-2 scales by themselves to make formal diagnoses of mental disorders, such as schizophrenia or clinical depression, because a high score on these scales aren't specific to a single disorder. Nevertheless, in everyday practice, clinicians sometimes misuse these scales for this purpose. A descendant of the MMPI is the California Psychological Inventory, sometimes called the Common Person's MMPI. Like the MMPI, the CPI was constructed empirically. Unlike the MMPI, the CPI is designed for assessing personality traits in the normal range, such as dominance, flexibility, and sociability, making it a popular measure in college counseling centers and industry. Most CPI scales are reasonably reliable over time and are valid for assessing personality traits. Nevertheless, the CPI inherited some of its parent shortcomings. In particular, many of the CPI scales are highly correlated and largely redundant. So another type of test is rationally or theoretically constructed. So psychologists have developed many structured personality measures using a rational theoretical method of test construction. In contrast to an empirical approach, this approach requires test developers to begin with a clear-cut conception of a trait and write items to assess that conceptualization. So Costa and McCrae used a rational/theoretical approach to develop the NEO Personality Inventory Revised, commonly abbreviated as the NOPIR. And this is a very widely used measure of the Big Five. So if you'd like to take a personality test similar to this, I found one online for you. Unfortunately, access to the actual NEOPIR you have to pay for, but I think what I found is close enough to kind of give you an idea of what taking the actual NEOPIR would be. So the NEO has demonstrated impressive validity in a large number of studies. For example, scores on the NEO for conscientiousness are negatively correlated with measures of risk-taking, and scores of NEO agreeableness are negatively correlated with measures of physical aggression. However, not all rational theoretical tests boast a strong track record of validity. Another one is the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, commonly just called the Myers-Briggs. And it's probably the most widely administered personality test in the world. Given several million times a year, it's used by thousands of companies in the US alone, including 89 of the Fortune 100. Even Harry Potter was assigned his Hogwarts house using a similar system to the Myers-Briggs. That's right, you heard me. The Sorting Hat administered a version of the Myers-Briggs to give students their Hogwarts houses. So this is based loosely on Jung's personality theory. The Myers-Briggs sorts respondents into one of 4 binary categories. There's introversion, extroversion, sensing, intuiting, thinking, feeling, and judging, perceiving, yielding a total of 16 personality types. So I put this figure here. I know it's kind of hard to read on the slides. What I would recommend is download the slides and enlarge the picture to get a better look at it, or you can just Google Myers-Briggs personality types. Either one works. Although some claim that Myers-Briggs is helpful for predicting job performance and satisfaction, research raises serious doubts about its reliability and validity. Most respondents don't obtain the same Myers-Briggs personality type on retesting only a few months later, indicating the test has low test-retest reliability, which is pretty much what it sounds like. You take it once, then a little bit later you take it again. Additionally, Myers-Briggs scores often aren't related in especially consistent ways to either the Big Five or to measures of job preferences, suggesting that the test has questionable validity. Another type of test is a projective test. So projective tests are tests consisting of ambiguous stimuli that examinees must interpret or make sense of. If you've ever looked for shapes in the clouds, you have a sense of what it's like to take a projective test. Some projective techniques ask people which colors or animals they prefer, or ask them to fill in cartoon bubbles of people engaged in hypothetical conversations. Influenced by psychoanalytic views of personality, especially Freud's notion of projection, these techniques rest on a crucial premise: projective hypothesis, which is the hypothesis that in the process of interpreting ambiguous stimuli, examinees project aspects of their personality onto the stimulus. Test interpreters can then work in reverse by examining people's answers for clues concerning their personality traits. In contrast to structured personality tests, projective tests permit respondents considerable latitude in their answers. Proponents of projective tests view them as stealth weapons of the psychologist's arsenal. By circumventing respondents' defense mechanisms, they presumably offer valuable information concerning unconscious conflicts. Projective tests are among the most controversial of all psychological instruments because their reliability and validity remain in dispute. So the best known projective measure is the Rorschach inkblot test, developed by Hermann Rorschach in the early 1920s. The Rorschach, as it's commonly known, consists of 10 symmetrical inkblots, 5 in black and white, like the 2 shown here, and 5 in color. The Rorschach is one of the most commonly used personality measures, and it is administered to roughly 6 million people per year. Rorschach examiners ask respondents to look at each inkblot and say what it resembles. Examiners then score respondents' answers for numerous characteristics supposedly associated with personality traits. Many of the interpretations have a certain surface plausibility, which may account for some of the Rorschach's popularity. However, despite its widespread use, the Rorschach is scientifically controversial. Ooh, big shocker on that one. The test-retest reliabilities of many of its scores are unknown, and their inter-rater reliabilities are often problematic at best. Moreover, although psychologists commonly use the Rorschach to assist them making psychiatric diagnoses, there's little evidence that it validly detects the features of most mental disorders, such as mood, anxiety, or personality disorders, or relates to criminal traits or behaviors. The lone major exceptions to low validity are conditions marked by abnormal thinking like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. That is, the Rorschach is modestly valid when we treat it simply as a measure of thinking and examine the extent to which people's responses deviate from reality. There are also few replicated associations between the Rorschach scores and most personality tests, such as impulsivity, oppositionalism, narcissism, or anxiety proneness. There's also evidence that respondents can successfully fake schizophrenia, depression, and perhaps other disorders on the Rorschach. This is a particular problem because in the MMPI-2, the Rorschach doesn't contain scales to detect malingering. Perhaps the greatest shortcoming of the Rorschach is the lack of evidence for its incremental validity, which is the extent to which a test contributes information beyond other more easily collected measures. Given that the Rorschach takes a long time to administer, roughly 45 minutes, 45, not 425, 45, and even longer to interpret, roughly hour and a half to 2 hours, we'd hope it yields information we couldn't get from more efficient measures. However, with only a few exceptions, there's no evidence that the Rorschach exhibits incremental validity beyond more easily collected data such as life history info or the MMPI. In fact, adding the Rorschach to other measures may sometimes decrease the validity of the clinician's diagnosis, probably because some clinicians intend to heavily invalid Rorschach information at the expense of more valid information. The second most frequently administered test, or projective test, is the Thematic Apperception Test, commonly known as the TAT, which was developed by Murray and Morgan. The TAT consists of 31 cards depicting ambiguous situations, most of them interpersonal in nature. One of the cards is entirely blank. So as a mnemonic device, we can think of TAT as tell a tale, because examinees construct a story based on each card. Most clinicians interpret the TAT on an impressionistic basis, meaning that they inspect the content of the examinee's stories and analyze them using clinical intuition alone. Some authors claim to the contrary. There's little evidence that impressionistic TAT interpretations generate scores with adequate reliability or validity. Scores derived from the TAT have often failed to distinguish psychiatric patients, such as people with clinical depression, from non-patients, or correlate in predicted directions with personality traits. Nor is there much evidence that TAT scores possess incremental validity beyond other sources of information, such as the MMPI. One promising scoring system for the TAT uses cards similar to those on the TAT to assess needs for achievement. Using this system, psychologists score responses to the cards based on the extent to which respondent stories emphasize achievement-oriented themes such as academic or career success. In contrast, TAT measures of achievement possess at least some validity. They correlate positively with occupational success and income, although these associations are low, meaning they're low correlations, probably around the 0.3-ish or less. The TAT is also moderately valid for assessing what psychologists call object relations, which are perceptions of others, such as if people see themselves as helpful or harmful. Another popular group of projective tests is human figure drawings, which I have pictured here. So, the Draw a Person test requires respondents to draw a person or people in any way they wish. Many clinicians who administer these measures interpret them on the basis of specific drawing signs. For example, large eyes presumably reflect suspiciousness. Nevertheless, the correlations between human figure drawings and personality traits are low to non-existent, nor is there much evidence that self-proclaimed figure drawing experts are much better than the rest of us at inferring personality traits from them. Perhaps more problematically, scores derived from human figure drawings are confounded with artistic ability. Research suggests that people may be diagnosed as psychologically disturbed merely because they can't draw well, which is no bueno. So lastly, we have common pitfalls. So the P.T. Barnum effect is the tendency of people to accept descriptions that apply to almost everyone as applying specifically to them. This effect demonstrates that personal validation, which is the use of subjective judgments of accuracy, is a flawed method of evaluating a test's validity. This is commonly seen in astrological horoscopes, predictions of psychics, palm reading, etc. Despite the widespread use of these methods, there is no evidence of their validity. People are especially likely to accept P.T. Barnum descriptions they believe are tailored specifically to them. This finding probably helps to explain why horoscopes are often so convincing. In an illustration of the P.T. Barnum effect, Blackmore found that clients pick out their own tarot card readings from 9 other readings at better than chance levels. However, when tarot card readers gave readings to clients in a face-to-face setting, clients found them extremely accurate. The same principle applies to astrology. The P.T. Barnum effect can also fool psychologists into believing that certain traits describe specific groups of people, even when they don't. Many pop psychologists claim that adult children of alcoholics display a distinctive constellation of personality traits. And lastly, personality assessment evaluated scientifically. So personality assessment has contributed to psychologists' ability to detect personality traits, both normal and abnormal, and has helped them predict significant real-world behaviors. Moreover, psychologists have succeeded in developing numerous personality measures, especially structured personality tests with adequate validity and reliability. Research also indicates that a few projective techniques can achieve satisfactory reliability and validity. For instance, scores on certain sentence completion tests, which ask respondents to complete a sentence stem, are associated with delinquency, moral development, and other important characteristics. Given the scientific progress that psychologists have made in assessing personality, but why do many continue to use measures with weak scientific support? In particular, why do some clinicians still rely on scores from the Myers-Briggs and several projective tests like Rorschach that have very questionable reliability and validity? No, why? Why? It's because they're prone to the same errors in thinking as the rest of us, one of which is illusory correlations. Such commonplace errors in thinking remind us of a theme we've underscored throughout. Personal experience can be misleading. Scientific methods, which are essential safeguards against human error, can allow us to determine if we should trust our personal experience or disregard it in favor of evidence to the contrary. In this way, these methods can help us reduce the risk of error and help us to better measure and understand personality. And as always, make sure you're going to your SI sessions, make sure you're going to Kelly sessions, make sure you're getting quizzes and stuff like that done in a timely manner. Don't save it all until the last minute. And lastly, just as a little serotonin boost for everybody, she's been napping there for like an hour and a half. So. Right, just a couple quick housekeeping things. So remember, quizzes for chapters 12, 13, 14, 15. Those are all due Saturday, May 1st, 9 p.m. Central Standard Time. And exam 3 is due Sunday, May 2nd, 9 p.m. Central Standard Time.